Good afternoon. My name is Peter Iwanowicz. Let me just sort of give you a little bit more of a biological sketch of me, because this is going to be a tricky one for a person who runs an environmental organization to pretend sort of he's not running that group today before you all. The organization I lead is called Environmental Advocates. We're a leading environmental group based in the state capital of Albany. I've run that group for the last 2 years and was brought on board by the county executive in a voluntary capacity, like executives of environmental groups have spare time to do this, in a voluntary capacity to help him sort of sort through several different issues related to crude oil transport through Albany County. Let me just give you a little bit of background as to what was going on in Albany County a couple of years ago when I took the helm at Environmental Advocates. And there are members of the sort of the community groups and community leaders here in the audience with us today. When I took the helm at Environmental Advocates in November of 2013, there was a little bit of discussion going on about the enormous transformation of the sleepy little port of Albany. It's a port that sits on the Hudson River. It was most noted for gasoline transfer stations. It was most noted for sort of storing heating oil to get to upstate New York and into the New England area. So barges would come up the Hudson River, offload product in these storage tanks. Trucks would take it off to markets. That's what we sort of knew the oil industry was in the Port of Albany, up until about 2010/2011, when literally a massive transformation took place, where the industry was unlocking fuels, as you heard earlier today, from North Dakota. They needed to get it out to market. And these small companies that had fuel depots in the city of Albany at the port decided, rather than always just receiving stuff upriver, let's become an export locale. So folks like Roger Downs, who's from this local chapter of the Sierra Club, Roger's here, Vivian Cornegay, who's a city council member from the city of Albany, my staff, Connor Bainbrook, is over on the side. There were a lot of different leaders sort of working on this issue and wondering what is going on with our Port of Albany. And you cannot mistake what happens when your community gets transformed with these trains. And in Albany, it's kind of interesting because in order to get to the port, the trains actually have to go down literally the median strip of the major interstate highway that borders the river. So there's no hiding what was going on. The trains are sitting there day in and day out. And people were beginning to ask questions why, especially after the tragic events in Quebec that summer at Lake Maganti. And as they began to ask questions, they realized that these massive expansion had been green-lighted by the state agency. They had not gone through any kind of systemic environmental review. They had not gone through a real public process. And they had allowed for this expansion in New York State in a community that is listed as an environmental justice community, disregarding their own policies to run these projects through a whole environmental justice analysis, notwithstanding the fact that it didn't do a big environmental impact analysis. I'll also add Justin Mikulka is here, a great blogger that's covered this issue in Albany with great aplomb over the years. Sorry, Justin, I missed you earlier. So there's a lot of folks that have been with us in the Albany fight, and I'm proud to sort of be here amongst them because they really led it, and I had the pleasure of sort of helping the county executive move forward on it. So that's what was sort of happening, this massive influx. But one of the proposals that folks were able to latch onto was the latest one, which was we had this enormous influx of Bakken crude oil coming into the port, literally several train loads a day. But then one company decided that's not enough. What we want to try to start doing is heating up heavy crude oil. And I think Roger was the first one to tell me this. He said, this is tar sands. I said, our own Keystone XL pipeline moment here in Sleepy Albany? He said, yeah. And I said, well, this is bad. They should be doing a full EIS. Well, they're not. They decided to give you a negative declaration and allow for even more dangerous and dirty crude to come on. So we already have hundreds of Bakken oil trains coming through Albany, and the oil company there then wanted to get permission from the state to bring tar sands through. And what they needed is a permit to allow them to create boilers to heat this stuff up. If you know anything about tar sands, you can't just move it. They were going to bring it by train, heat it up, where they also have a lot of Bakken oil trains, and then transfer that tar sands to barges like they're doing with Bakken fuel oil, on barges in tankers, and float it down the Hudson River. Now at this point you're probably saying, Pete, what could go wrong? And you'd be right. And if you can believe it, the state agency was not going to require a full environmental impact review. And once again, they were not going to run a screen to assess from an environmental justice perspective, you know, what egregious issues could result from putting in boilers to heat up tar sands oil next to Bakken oil trains that were coming in, oil cars that were extremely dangerous at the time. So that's the sort of the lay of the land in about a minute to 2 minutes. It's more complicated than that. The stories are out there courtesy of Justin and the Albany newspapers and others, and there are great leaders in the room and should talk to all of them about this whole issue. What I want to do is sort of describe Albany County and some of the local leaders' sort of response. And Vivian with the city council and county legislators started issuing resolutions calling for action, trying to push the state, push the county to sort of come in and take action. And the county executive sort of looked at this and said, well, what can we do? This federal preemption, you know, what realistically are we, you know, have the ability to do? And they stumbled upon something really unique. And I think everybody should really think about this as you leave here, is there are enormous powers that may get you around federal preemption, especially when these tank cars come off the railways and are sitting on siding areas, or they're in a port facility where they're no longer technically looked at as railroad. And you can really examine public health law. I don't know if it's in my bio, I forget if I told this, but I'm a public health guy. I worked at the American Lung Association for most of my formative environmental years, and I always look at things from a public health lens as to who lives, who dies, which kids get sick, which illnesses we can prevent from. But the county executive looked at public health law and said, we can issue a moratorium under public health law, and the county health commissioner can actually stop this project from going forward because people might get sick and there's a public nuisance. So they didn't look at environmental statute, it was straight up public health law. And in New York State, that county health official really is an extension of the health commissioner. So it's a really powerful sort of tool. And what they did is essentially issue this moratorium under public health law and said, we're not going to allow the heating of crude oil in Albany County until I get a clearance from the health commissioner that can be done safely. That moratorium was issued in March of 2014 and it still exists, and I'm talking with you today. And I will say this, there's a couple of big factors that when you look at the health and safety and environmental conditions and how to prevent, you know, this issue from becoming worse. And granted, this moratorium does not affect the current situation of Bakken fuel oil that's coming through the trains. It still comes through today. It's still a very dangerous situation. Just because we have a moratorium doesn't mean that the people who live in the public housing project known as Ezra Prentice homes, who are literally, I mean, if I should have brought some pictures along with me, I didn't, I apologize, but they're literally a chain link fence away from the back doors of these homes and these bomb trains. I mean, there's no exaggeration there. It's a chain link fence that separates the bomb trains from where these people live. It is an environmental justice community. The state has yet to really do a fine environmental justice screen. The other issues in the county is you know, we're obviously a capital of New York, so we've got a heavy urban center where the port is, but it's also quite rural. And these bomb trains go through rural parts of the county, the northern part. There's trains that come down from Canada into Albany and then across from Buffalo into Albany. And there are places where the trains are going quite fast through rural counties where people are on well water. There's one line that actually runs adjacent to a major drinking water reservoir. And nobody at the state or anywhere else has really stopped to say, does this make sense? Especially tar sands oil next to a drinking water reservoir. If any of you know about tar sands, it's impossible to clean up. That reservoir is off limits forever if there were ever an accident there. So there's a lot of public health and safety issues that you can do, and putting a moratorium in place puts some of that to end. So the committee that was formed came out of that executive order and came out of the moratorium that was lifted, not lifted, was put in place. And the county executive sort of asked me to chair a committee that comprised of many different people that sort of came in and came out of the committee. But two core players were Chris Amato from Earth Justice, an attorney that's representing the residents of Ezra Prentice Homes and the Sierra Club in litigation. He's a wonderful friend of mine and just a great colleague on these issues. And also Phil Landrigan, who's a world sort of renowned but national treasure pediatrician from Mount Sinai, agreed to sort of sit with me on this committee and really assess all the different things we could do. Now, there's a full panoply of anything the county executive can do about pointing the finger at the state or the federal government. The federal issues, I think the earlier panel sort of went over them, about the trains being unsafe, the new standards are too lax, don't come in fast enough. Even the federal standards on the carrying of tar sands oil by rail are too weak and too long because they don't view tar sands as highly flammable like Bakken. They don't sort of take into account that when this stuff spills, you can damage huge infrastructure, you can damage well systems, you can damage wastewater treatment systems, the Hudson River, you know, so that even the standards they put in play to allow that oil to be, you know, carried by rail are way too lax because they don't view it as a big major flammable product. So we looked at a lot of different things, and what we found is that there's a lot that the federal government needs to do more on, and there's a lot that the state of New York can do more on, especially as you heard my earlier comments here. Let me just pause for a moment. Also the moratorium that was issued and the executive order really, I think for the first time, reaffirmed the agitation of the community and the local leaders who were calling for action. The county executive was, if you don't know him, but he's a former city firefighter. He's a member of the National Guard. He definitely is one that's willing to take risks. And I said, if you want me to volunteer to be on this, you got to take some risks. You got to take not only risks to sort of help people and understand the issue, but you got to take political risks. And in New York, that means that a local elected official had to stand up to the governor and say, no, you've got to do better. And I think that was an important sort of moment for a lot of us in the community because he was willing to do that. So I agreed to sort of chair the committee knowing that we were going to push and push hard and not simply take a lowest common denominator approach and continue to, you know, understand that this was going to be a political fight for the county executive with the governor. So we, in our report that we released in May of this year, we will have it up on a website, you know, after the conference is over. I didn't want to print it out and share it with you all, but it will be up there as well as the executive orders and moratorium. It pushed the federal government to act sooner and faster on a range of things, and that's still a fight that will go on. We'll work with our federal colleagues, we'll work with our environmental colleagues to try to push the federal government to improve upon the current safety standards for the rail cars now, to lower the speeds, particularly in urban centers, but, you know, 40-mile-per-hour train falling off a trestle next to a drinking water reservoir probably doesn't make sense to allow it to go 40 miles per hour, especially if it's carrying tar sands. So there's a lot of different things in there in terms of the timeline. It's just too slow. These cars are unsafe now. We know they're unsafe. We've also, in our report, called to push the state to act faster. You know, we were gratified when our advocacy efforts from the county and all the environmental groups that worked on this thing and the local leaders, when the state decided to rescind its earlier decision on that negative declaration. So they pulled back that decision that was going to fast track the heating of tar sands oil. So we've won at least a partial timeout from that fast tracking of having tar sands added to our Bakken mix. We've seen a dramatic curtailment of trains going in there with Bakken as the, you know, the overall oil markets have softened. So there's a slight reprieve in that we don't have the massive amounts of oil that have been flowing through the port as we did a year or 2 years ago. But we know that's just sort of temporary. It's not something that's going to be long-standing. It's a market condition. So the fight will continue to go on. So we are fighting to ensure that the state does a full environmental impact statement to look at all the issues at the port. There is litigation that the county executive has joined, looking at the air permits that were already given to the Port of Albany facility. So it looks at the evaporative emissions, it looks at a lot of the dangerous toxins that waft off these facilities, and we believe that the facilities got permits when they didn't deserve them. They used different accounting methodologies and sort of, you know, did a little bit of an accounting mechanism to keep without having to do what we call a full review under the Clean Air Act. I won't get too wonky, but if you know it, it's a new source review. They try to circumvent that. So there's litigation that's trying to push, you know, for a better accounting of what's going on there to lower the air emissions. That may also, you know, move the port facility in a different spot. We pushed the state to even look at the oil spill fund, so they increased the amount of revenue that oil companies have to put into the state spill fund. It's not nearly what it should be, but at least there's more money's going into a spill fund to help first responders at least have some better equipment in place and to protect sensitive ecosystems and to map out a little bit more what might happen if a catastrophic event happens. And I think the state continually needs to be pushed to engage the community, to really do that thorough environmental justice analysis that they have yet to perform for that area. I mean, you have this enormous facility that has grown up in the shadow of an environmental justice community, and literally it is that chain link fence away from the public housing known as the Ezra Prentice homes. So the state needs to do much more on that. The state could also exercise powers. They have refused to do so far, but the committee did advocate that the county executive advocate this way, and he has, for the state to issue something under their environmental conservation law on summary abatement, where you find a compelling nuisance or public health threat that is so grave that you essentially, the commissioner of environmental conservation, can issue a stop order, a cease and desist order. And we're using the concept of everybody knows that the rail cars that are coming into this facility are unsafe. Why are we allowing it to go forward? The commissioner could use his powers under summary abatement to do that. The state, unfortunately, has so far refused that request, but maybe over time they'll get around to doing it. We also, as good outside advocates, pushing the county executive, pushed him to do more, to push him to update laws requiring faster spill response notification. Often spills happen, fires are raging, and things are happening at ports, and the community's not aware. The county executive's not aware, so the community's not aware of what's going on as rapidly. So they're modifying and modernizing those laws. We also are pushing the county executive to look at his own ability to do summer abatement. Under that public health law, as an extension of the state, if the state doesn't want to do it, the county may be able to exercise their own summary abatement. So they're examining that aspect of it too. And I will also mention that a good key ally in a lot of this has been the local first responders, particularly our locally elected sheriff. Those of you in the environmental community, I really urge you to sort of link up with first responders. They know a lot of stuff about what goes on in the communities, where the bad stuff is. They don't need to tell us. They know where it is. But they also understand the environment in a much more acute, sensitive way than I think a lot of us have really understood. And the sheriff of Albany and I really have spent a lot of time together sort of thinking through, if bad stuff happens, what do we need to think about? And I started talking to him about drinking water and sewage treatment plants and well water along the rails. And one of the requests we did that the railroad companies has not lived up to yet is allow us to ride the rails. Maybe not me, but at least the sheriff is in team. Ride the rails so they can see from a rail eye view what they need to know and how they can get equipment in if they need to do it, or whether they need to shut down drinking water supplies if things go bad. That's not something that I think we often think about, but first responders should have access to those rails to be able to do their own sort of spotting of the conditions so they know how difficult things will be if things go bad at any point around the rails in their community. So let me just wrap up. I think I have 2 more minutes, maybe less. Public health statute, powerful weapon. Really think about these trains and whether or not they're making people sick and cutting lives short. It's a place that environmental advocates and others don't often go, but there's a lot that can be done on that. And also just continue their advocacy. Push folks like your county leaders to be very creative in thinking through the issues related to preemption, looking at those things like summary abatement and exercising tools under public health statute that they probably haven't thought of before, because it's a key way to go forward. And last but not least, remember, a lot of these air pollution issues, the Clean Air Act is a public health statute. It's not an environmental conservation law. It's a public health law, and it's there for a reason. So think through your strategies and tactics that way, the way the county executive in Albany does. So thank you.